Hola, damas y caballeros, vecinos, vecinas, amigos, amigas, bienvenidos, welcome. I'm Sonia Gutierrez, and I'm honored and very happy to be here and welcome you all to the 7th Annual Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, Our Story pre-event session, which kicks off our main event scheduled for this Saturday, October 31st, right here on this platform. So the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, known as LCFC, is an organization of great people with the goal of elevating our Latino community. LCFC keeps the Colorado Latino community connected through events like this one that build relationships, focus on cultural traditions, offer performances by local and international artists, and provide powerful platforms for Latinos to tell their own stories and their own narratives. At its core, LCFC is led by Latinos for Latinos. And as many as you know, in the past, we've had the pleasure of meeting in person to celebrate our community, but as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're doing this virtually. It's not going to be the same, but we're just going to have to make it work. Technology will be our new best friend, and patience is going to be our other best friend. And in what may be the best gift is the knowledge that we, as a community, are not giving up no matter what. We're sharing this time and strengthening our bond as a community. For this, I am so grateful. De esto se lo agradezco de todo corazón a todos ustedes. We hope that you're safe at home or at school or in one of our virtual cafes and are following safety guidelines, wearing a mask in public and washing your hands. We know our community has been hit hard by COVID-19, and we encourage you all to do whatever you can to protect yourself and your families. And if you need help, just ask. Si necesitas ayuda, solo pregunta. There are many local and state organizations right here at your fingertips that can be found on this eAttend platform under Advocacy Central. So that's where you can find all that help. I'd like to share a little bit more information about this remarkable organization, the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado. The LCFC has invested $5 million in the past 5 years to organizations statewide that mobilize, support, and respond to the needs of our community. The act of giving is out of the organization's generous core and heart, knowing that each and every gift is multiplied as it helps the Latino community thrive. The LCFC is proud of philanthropic work in the community and excited to spend the time together as a community exploring some of the many facets of our culture and our people. So just like this, today's presentation. This is a special day for us. Vecinos y amigos, young people, our elders and families gather together, enjoying this time as we take a good look at how does our identity affect how we engage with each other, or not. I'm looking forward for this conversation that will be led by award-winning playwright Tony Meneses and a number of thoughtful leaders. I know that it will be fascinating and totally thought-provoking. I myself was raised right here in Denver. I love this city so much, and I love and respect this organization. Whenever and however possible, I support them de todo corazón. I was born in Parral, Chihuahua. Ahí sí me escuchan el acento más a ratito. And I was brought to Colorado when I was 2 years old. My mom, to this day, she's cleaned houses, and my dad, he works at a tire shop. So I come from humble home with incredible values. I went into journalism because I wanted to see people who look like me tell stories about our community in a fair and just way. LCFC has played such a big role in my life with mentorship by Rachel and Carlos. They were the ones who told me to explore opportunities in different places and states, which led me all the way to South Carolina, where I was the first bilingual reporter doing stories on air in English and Spanish. It was very well received. It was an incredible experience, and I thank Carlos and Rachel for helping me make that decision. LCFC, Carlos, and Rachel I hold them very close and dear to my heart. They've made a big difference in my life, and I know they've made a big difference in many others' lives. That's why it is my honor to welcome the president and CEO of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado. Bienvenido a mi amigo, Carlos Martinez.
Gracias, Sonia, for your continued support of the Our Story Forum and of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado. You have so graciously supported our work over the past 5 years, and we're so grateful and appreciative. And welcome to all of you who have joined us to be part of this discussion on Latino identity and coming together to build our civic power. Like many of you, I grew up with the expression, ni de aquí, ni de allá. No, or neither from here or there. Throughout my life, I have been labeled as a Mexican, American, Spanish, Hispanic, Chicano, Latino, Latinx, as well as many other labels, but I won't go into those. Raised with a strong connection to my Mexican roots, culture, language, and food, I grew up trying to figure out how to juggle my identity to fit in with my family, friends, school, church, work, and in the communities I was a part of, whether it was the Latino community, my Asian neighborhood I grew up in, the gay community, my community back in Mexico, or the community at large. Communities that I navigated in and out constantly, becoming pretty good at juggling these spaces. However, I still felt ni de aquí, ni de allá, never quite belonging. My parents are from a small rural farming town in the mountains of Michoacan, Mexico, called Urépero, and came to the United States not understanding the history, language, customs, traditions, or systems of this new world they would now call home. Guided by a hope and a dream of a better life for them and their children, their naivete of a society that was not designed for them to succeed caused them great pain, which was hard to understand and accept, because after all, this was America, tierra de oportunidad, land of opportunity. Feeling hopeless in helping their children navigate a new and strange reality, my parents' contribution to me and my siblings was to install a strong identity of being Mexicano. Throughout my formative years, I struggled with my identity and the intersectionalities of who I was. Being gay, first gen, going to college, a person who really enjoyed the arts, as well as growing up with an inferiority complex, because when I went to school, I didn't speak English, and so therefore I was tracked as kind of like the low-level folks, customs, traditions, etc. And let's not forget colorism within our families. Over the years, I've learned a lot about myself and who I am and what it means to call myself a Latino. Living on both coasts of the United States and being fortunate to travel throughout Latin America, Mexico, the Caribbean, Central and South America, I have shared and celebrated what it means to be Latino through the eyes and the soul of so many people. Give me an arepa, a pastel, an empanada, a plátano, a pupusa, tamal or tortilla, and accompany that with some norteñas, some salsa, some cumbias, some bachata, boleros, mariachi, banda, or just some good old cruising suavecito oldies, and some great conversation, and we are friends for life. The connection, the cariño y amor we have for one another binds us. Our differences disappear. Somos familia. Latinos in Colorado cover the spectrum. I know Latinos who have been here for many generations, Chicanos, Puerto Ricanos, Cubanos, Dominicanos, Mexicanos, Central American, and folks from South America, from the top of Venezuela and Colombia to the bottom of Argentina and Chile, and all those countries in between. We are a diverse Latino Colorado. Through my work here at the Latino Community Foundation, I see, hear, and feel the pain that so many Latinos, no matter where they're from, endure in Colorado. Latinos being taken advantage at work. Children being expelled from school for justifiable reason. Folks being ignored because of an accent. Neighborhoods being left behind because they're brown or poor, and many other reasons. COVID has affected our community disproportionately. People have lost their dad, their brother, their mother, and abuelita. Others have lost a job, their car, or their home. Families are so stressed because of having to juggle too much with so little. The Our Story Forum on Saturday is about rebuilding our future together. But today, we talk about our Latino identity. No matter how you identify, where in the Americas your families are from, or the language we speak, we need to come together as one. In order to reach our collective power, we must let go of the me and embrace the we. Once we come together as we accomplish great things. Our panel discussion brings together 4 generations: baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, Gen Z, to have a conversation on the diversity of Latinos and the need to celebrate our diverse identities while bringing them together to build that civic power that benefits one community. Picture the conversation happening in true Latino kitchen conversation style. That's how it's going to take place. Again, thank you for joining us, and I will now pass it back to Sonia so that she can kick off our conversation. Gracias.
Thank you, Carlos, for your good words, y también muchísimas gracias por todo lo que haces en y por nuestra comunidad latina en nuestro estado de Colorado. Before we continue, let's make sure we stay connected on our digital space called Conexión Café. Give it a try and share your experience on social media. We'll see each other there. And now I'm very excited to introduce our guest who will lead this thought-provoking discussion on Latino identity, merging the me with we. Tony Meneses is the creator and playwright of the obra de teatro called 2050, which looks at identity in a political race for the year 2050. ¿Te imaginas? ¿Cómo será? So his work on this play makes him the perfect moderator for the discussion on identity and how we interact with each other or not. This multi-generational conversation on identity will include Deb Ortega, professor from the University of Denver, Aron Abeyta, poet, and Izabella Williams, first-year student at Metro State University. These 3 generations of Coloradoans will explore the role that identity plays in our ability to come together and ask the question, will we be able to harness our collective power? So before we begin this conversation, let's watch this video montage called I Am.
I'm Latino.
I'm a Latina of Ecuadorian descent.
I am Chicana.
Soy mexicano y soy latino.
I'm Latina, Chicana, or Tejana.
I am an indigenous mestiza.
I am Chicano.
I am a Boricua.
Soy Latino.
I am Latina y Chicana.
Soy Latina guatemalteca.
I am Latino.
I am Mexican.
I am a Latina.
I am Gen Z.
Soy de la generación X.
I am a millennial.
I am the overlap of a baby boomer generation with the Generation X.
I am a millennial.
I am Generation X.
Baby boomer.
Soy generación X.
I am a baby boomer.
I'm a millennial.
And I am a philanthropist.
I am an immigrant.
I am a mother.
Tia.
Líder comunitario.
Daughter.
Y trabajador esencial.
First generation college graduate.
System shifter.
Son of Mexican immigrants.
I'm a brother.
Atleta.
A social justice advocate.
Loving daughter.
Madre.
The mother of a Generation Z who will make a difference in this world.
A social worker.
Proud DACA recipient.
Inmigrante.
A daughter.
I'm queer.
A sister.
Friend.
Soy conector.
Advocate for the Latino community.
The bomba dancer that goes ahead and propagates what Puerto Rico is all about in this country.
Dueño de mi propia compañía.
Advocate.
Conectora en el área de Mombelo.
I'm an artist.
Husband.
A daughter.
Padre orgulloso.
Pertenezco a la comunidad LGBT.
I'm a public servant.
A dog lover.
Canine mommy.
Tío.
Soy esposo.
a proud wife,
immigrant,
fifth generation Coloradan,
creative,
a dog mom,
proud Colorado native,
Holder of an advanced graduate degree.
Soy inmigrante.
a DACA recipient,
and good troublemaker.
a philanthropist,
and a chingona.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion. Sonia, thank you for that introduction. I'll reintroduce myself for a larger context. My name is Tony Meneses. I'm a playwright whose play premiered at the Denver Center earlier this year in January and then closed March 1st. The play was called 2050 and dealt with a lot of the issues and conversations around identity, which we're going to be having today in this roundtable discussion. Other content to know, I identify as Latino / Mexican immigrant. My pronouns are he, him, and my generation is millennial. Bella, why don't you introduce yourself next?
Hello, everybody. My name is Bella. I'm currently a freshman in college at Metro State in Denver, and I identify as Afro-Latina or Afro-Caribbean, and my pronouns are her, she, and hers.
I'll go next. I'm Deb Ortega. I'm a faculty member at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver and the director of the Latinx Center at the University of Denver. I'm a proud boomer. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I was born Mexican-American, and then I was Hispanic, and then I was Latino, and now I'm Latinx.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aron. I got multiple titles, poet, mayor, professor, director of a school, and I identify as Chicano. It's always been my preferred term. Mexicano is a close second, I suppose, because my dad identifies as Mexicano. And my pronouns are he, him, his, and I am Generation X.
Thank you all. So I want to just dive right in. So just for context for everyone watching at home, we're proudly setting up this conversation like a Mexican Latino kitchen table, right? At the end of the day, we all get to just participate and share and probably talk over each other and get a little messy and disagree and have fun and and have joy in even disagreements. And I think that's the most important part to remember. So I'm just going to start with the first question. And it's obviously a very broad one, but I think it's an important one. Who does our identity actually include? And how can reimagining that be empowering? So Deb, I'd love to hear from you first on that one.
For me, my identity, who does our identity actually include? For me, it includes anyone who wants to join in many ways, right? Like I think power is around how we come together, and that includes people who are interested in really supporting and culture and the way we think as a community, but also our different geographical and historical perspectives, right? So for me, Latinx means Puerto Ricans, Afro-Caribbeans, biracial people of all sorts, gay and lesbian Latinos, come join with us and be with us and have a conversation and stand up for our communities and participate in ways in which we all know that we're joined together and sort of part of humanity.
Aron, just to get your perspective.
The idea of, us standing together and standing up. And one of the reasons I prefer the term Chicano or Chicana, obviously, is because I've always associated that with civil rights, with the notion of fighting not only for identity, but for culture, for equitable inclusion in schools, equitable inclusion in government, and having a voice. And this decolonization of the mind has always been something that I've gravitated for, but I just necessarily didn't have words for it. But early on, when I first started going to college, that's when I discovered the term Chicano. And it just resonated with me because for a lot of the same reasons that Deb just mentioned, right? Because I find it to be inclusive for anybody that wants to have that voice for the voiceless. And whoever you consider to be on the periphery, to me, the Chicano and the Chicana is a term that identifies with people that fight for those people on the periphery.
You already want to dive into that and have a nice discussion. So it's so funny that the Chicano term, so my family arrived here in 1985, and that was actually a term that was derided where I grew up in Albuquerque, that because we were like Mexicans from Mexico, that Chicano was a different kind of Latino. So already, right, the way that hegemony and the oppressive structures pit us against each other. So I grew up thinking that Chicano was a bad term. It wasn't until I grew up and went to college, right, and got educated on the term that I was like, oh, this is like an empowering civil rights term. So obviously I've deconstructed that, but even right through childhood, right? And for my parents, they weren't consciously doing that, but they were sort of taught to believe that it was a negative association. So it's funny to see how these things just evolve, even generationally sometimes.
Yeah. That's why I admire Bella and the stage she's at and all the things she'll discover. I think it's so cool.
Yeah, one thing me and my mom, I was actually having a discussion with her about this, and I was like, it's going to be super interesting just to see my perspective as a, fresh out of high school, 18 years old, a freshman in college, versus like all of these, professors and things, and just seeing like how their experience will differ from mine and how that will differ from my cousins and my kids to come, and just how like everything is just going to be, there's going to be obviously similarities, but just to see how like those shape what you would like identify yourself as and things like that.
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because there's even within the professors difference. So in the way that Tony was talking about how his family felt excluded a little bit around the term Chicano, my parents didn't like to use the word Chicano, even though they weren't immigrants. My grandparents were immigrants, because they felt like Chicano meant like hoodlum, and they didn't want to be associated. So it was really actually their separation from Chicano was really about being more acculturated, more trying to be more white and protected and protecting us. And that also like is that other opposite form of separation from our own power and our identities.
Right, and our brothers and sisters, right? Yeah, same thing. It was. I think what my family took issue with is that it felt like it was like a watered down version of a Latino. That it was somehow lesser than the Mexicans that came here and were of that heritage and from that country. So obviously wrong, but like it is funny to see how just these conflicts get introduced into our lives that are out of our own like power. Aron, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just one of my earliest memories. I don't remember how old I was, but I was around 5 or 6 and sitting around my grandma and grandpa's table. We were eating macarrones. I remember that. And as we were eating the macarrones, I made a comment that we were Mexican. And my grandma stopped what she was doing and she spanked me, right? And when she spanked me, she said, "Don't ever call yourself that," right? And she told me, "We're Spanish." And it wasn't until much later I discovered, that was sort of her teaching me to beware, right? There's this world outside of this kitchen that is not so kind to people that call themselves a particular thing, right? Mexican in this instance. So none of my family identified as Spanish. It wasn't a choice. It was just something she was trying to teach me, right? That you're Spanish, not because you are descendant of Spaniards or conquistadores or any Spanish, because that's going to protect you when you go to school. That's going to protect you in this racist society, which I'm very much aware of, and what this is going to be like. So I don't want my grandkids to go through that very same thing that I had to go through. So yeah, for the longest time I was Spanish. And then when I chose to call myself Chicano, there was this sort of disconnect with some of my family members because they thought the Chicanos were somehow the opposite of Christian, right? That we were too into the Aztecas in Mexico and all these other things, and that we were, and that the Spanish part of us was somehow Christian, right? And that there was this distinction between those two things. So yeah, there's been a little bit of conflict ever since that lunch eating macarrones. And even to this day, I sort of still feel divided, even though I do prefer the term Chicano. But I've heard all these things that you've mentioned, right, about hoodlum and lesser than and this derogatory term. And it's just a discovery. It's just a process. And So yeah, like Deb, multiple identities to get to Chicano.
That's what I love about, I think, our community is that, we're such a rich diaspora first and foremost, right? So it's within geography, even within country of origin. I think I mentioned when we all met for the first time that, Mexicans from LA are very different than Mexicans who are based in Texas. It's just, and that's what I find so beautiful. But obviously, it creates a lot of conflict sometimes in terms of how we understand and relate. What I'm curious about is just how this has evolved. I'm not a historian, but the 90s for me were like the Hispanic decade, right? Like that was the term that was used, and then it evolved to Latino, and now we're in a moment of like Latinx, and how I'm seeing just generational conflict too. That younger generations are embracing the term more. Whereas older generations feel a little bit removed from it, or haven't even heard it. I think they just released an article recently that said that most boomer and older generations don't even know what Latinx is. So curious about your input on that. Bella, we'll start with you, just as someone who might be in the fold of like this terminology evolution. Do you have a perspective on how we kind of continue to evolve and how we even just identify ourselves?
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned that like obviously I wasn't alive for was like the 90s, but even like just talking to my mom about how like things were so different from the 90s, from the 2000s to the 10s to now the 20s, and seeing how like the evolution of the way people have described themselves and how people are more like open to hearing other people the way they describe themselves too, instead of just like, oh, like it's all one Mexican or it's all Chicano. Like now I feel more comfortable saying, oh, I'm Afro-Latina, rather than when I was younger, I would just have to be like, I'm Black, because that's what you would see when you look at me. And especially with all the Mexican kids that I went to school with, they would see me and be like, oh, like you're Black. And I was like, well, I'm Mexican too. But I mean, if you see that I'm Black, then I guess I'm just Black. But as I grew up and as I got older and like started to realize there's more Latinos that look like me and that are Black, like you don't have to look indigenous to be Latino, to be Mexican, to be, whatever you are, whatever you represent. And I think that it's very important that we become more like comfortable hearing people use different terminologies for the way that they'd want to describe themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what's beautiful is to accept that, right? Because I think I have a fear that sort of this conflict around the word like Latinx, for example, is just going to create people who are like against it and who are for it, and then suddenly we're like infighting again, right? And that somehow, we're just gonna, it's another example of like the Chicano example. Some of us identified with it, some of us grew up thinking that it was a negative term. So how we evolve past that to sort of say, all right, I'm cool identifying as this, and I'm cool with you identifying as that. It's all the same community, right? It's all same. We're all fighting the same fight, and that we don't allow sort of larger structures to sort of filter into the way that we think and the way that we even perceive each other. And I love that you brought up the Afro-Latina example too, right? In my perspective, I guess as the middle generation here, is that I've seen that not even be a conversation until 5 years ago. Suddenly now we're acknowledging Afro-Latinx heritage. Yeah. So your perspective, Bella, or anyone else's on, obviously we're having big conversations about race, not just within our community, but within the larger American community after this summer, and how we're holding ourselves accountable even within our Latino community of how we include the Afro-Latino experience, for example. So Deb, maybe to start with you, how have you seen that evolve in terms of larger inclusiveness and representation within sort of one definition, the way that we're kind of asked to think of ourselves as?
I've been thinking, I teach in social work. So we talk a lot about issues around expanding beyond or thinking about gender as just being female or male, that people can express their gender in many different ways. I think for Latinos, and I understand, and I embrace that, right? I embrace that philosophy. But for me, the struggle is when language is part of culture and our language is gendered, right? Like every noun is either male or female. It makes that way of trying to be open much more constrained. So I actually understand the struggle between generations and how are you supposed to explain this to your abuela? What does the X mean? And I'm sure abuela's well, it's how you spell the word, right? Like that piece and the conflict it inherently sets up just by the constraint of language and then sort of the cultural piece that goes with this. I was actually recently asked basically the question how do I explain Latinx to my mom, and I'm like, well, do you know Walter Mercado? Right? Like who's something more than one or the other, right? Like, and trying to use that as sort of an example. I think there's this other piece, like that's the within conversation, right? Within the Latino community, how do we talk about this? How do we make space for women who look like me, right? Like I'm not wearing large high heels and I don't wear makeup. You know, I'm not that kind of woman. So there's that conversation, or in conversation, where's the space for me? But there's this other conversation that I think outside of our community. So where people don't understand the language piece and they think, oh, that X is super cool. I think I'll add it on to like folks, Folx. And I'm like, oh, you don't understand how in some ways painful and difficult these conversations are within our community. And in some ways, that's one of those things you're like, you know, when salsa became the #1 condiment in the US, it's like now X is like the thing to be cool, but they don't understand what the connection is, right? So I think the beauty of it is, why do I have to be just one thing for the rest of my life? When I talk about all the things I am, with each of those definitions of myself, I've understood myself better. So, so I really try to resist being just having one identity, but I understand that I have multiple ways of thinking about my own identity, and that sometimes one identity is ahead of the other. Usually 99% of the time, it's definitely I'm Latina, right? Like that's just how I experience my whole world. And then it might be professor, it might be, you know, queer or lesbian, it might be any number of female, right? Like there's all these pieces in it. So, so I think I'm excited about the opportunity to live in a little bit of fluidity, so I don't have to be in a box all the time. And that's what I'm hoping. And I think some of that, really, I think you're right. I'm not sure. I'm the bottom end of the boomers, still a boomer. I'm not sure. I think this is a gift sort of time in history and acceptance that I think is really a beautiful place of where we're evolving to.
So is the X the crossing out of the box? Is the X the crossing out of the border? Is the X the crossing out of just one language and one mindset? Is that the way that Latinx could be maybe summed up? I'm legitimately asking.
Well, for me, it's like expanding that gender dichotomy, right? So, but I do like that as a new interpretation I might totally adopt, right? Like, yeah, you know, it's time for us to just cross out all the ways that things become exclusionary to us, right? And expanding that box. But how it's been introduced to me is that, you know, we're the place for people who's like are transgender, who span the they them, right, pronouns, and I do find just being female like this or male like that, like my dad was super tender as a guy. Right. And I experienced that a lot with the men in my family, actually. And so when I hear people talk about, oh, you know, to be a man and have some tenderness, then that's like being, oh, that's my feminine side. I'm like, no, that was just my dad's side, you know? So I kind of like that piece.
So it's even crossing out the way that we've used pronouns and language as part of the exclusionary process. Right? The first way we learn to divide is through language. And I like that. Thank you, Deb. I appreciate that.
Yeah, the way I was learned Latinx is that it is inclusive of those that identify as transgender or non-gender conforming, that we want to make them feel that they are part of our community too, in the way that, you know, the O can be masculine dominant, right? In the way that, you know, it scaffolds and supports the perceptions of like, oh, we're a machismo culture. So of course we defer to the male pronoun in that term. So how can we deconstruct it? And of course, as you know, the fluidity, the inclusiveness is, I think, always the goal. What I'm worried about, I think, in the future is like those that continue to use the term Latino, that's okay too, that's just how they identify, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're making everyone behave within that term, especially for older generations that, you know, as Deb pointed out, how do we explain this to our abuelas who are like, Latinx, what is that? That we, you know, that there is space for them too. And I think of an example. So I have my director from my show at the Denver Center. He's a professor as well at Northwestern. and he was doing a talk back or some sort of public speaking presentation. He kept using the word Latino, and one of his students raised their hand and said, actually, it's Latinx. And he felt so ashamed of himself for using that term that he felt like he'd done something wrong. So it's like, how do we make both sides of that equation feel supported and heard and seen, where none of them have like a negative connotation, that we're actually just kind of like hopefully hugging all of these terms together and saying, it's okay. I mean, Bella, I did to get your voice in here. Have you encountered that in terms of like these tensions, these quiet little moments of conflict in terms of how we identify and who we include or don't include?
Not too much, just because I feel like during school, I mean, it was kind of like, I wouldn't say segregated, but the groups of like people stayed to themselves. So like the Black kids stayed over here, the Latino kids stayed over here, like the white kids were in their little area, and like nobody ever really mixed. So I never really got to like, or even like when I would try to like hang out with the, you know, Latinx kids, they would like, I mean, they weren't really rude, but it just, I couldn't really relate to them on the level of like the fact that my agency was so much more different than theirs, because a lot of them were like first generation, spoke Spanish. And for me, I didn't really, I'm obviously not fluent in Spanish. So, and like just certain things, like our cultures were just so different because I'm so used to the Caribbean part of my Latino identity, which was more Puerto Rican and Jamaican rather than like Mexican, or even a lot of them were South American, like Chilean. There was a lot of Chileans, or like Salvadorian. So it was, the culture was super different, but even the way that they identified, they were always like Latino, Latina, from what I would like experience around them. It was never like Latinx or anything like that. And I feel like it's because they were super, their parents were super like traditional. So for them to try to like step out of the box and do anything different, their parents were like not having it at all. Which was another thing that's like, my generation is so much more open to like, you know, changing the narrative and like being outside of the norm and being more comfortable with that. Where in comparison to like a lot of my friends' parents were not comfortable with that whatsoever. So seeing the way that we like, and when I say we, I mean like Gen Z, my generation, like a lot of the time, especially with like Latinx kids, we would have to like, you know, act one way, kind of like code switching, like one way at home versus a way at school with our friends versus like another way. So I think it's just very like interesting to see, just because so many different types of Latinos identify a different way, especially with where their parents are from and how they have like assimilated to American culture.
A great segue into our second question, just for the sake of time, keeping that in mind. I can't remember who was assigned to read that one out loud, but I think it might be worth putting it into the pot at this point.
I'll do it. When a community has a strong identity, does that bring power to the community?
Well, that's a tough one. It depends on how we define power, I suppose. I don't want to get too ambiguous with that term, because the community I'm from, if money is power, then nobody has power, right? And if land and water rights and being connected to your ancestry is power, then we used to be rich and we used to be powerful, right? So looking forward in the rear view mirror, I think that looking forward away from the rear view mirror, I should say, to me, it's become this sort of power being synonymous with survival, right? Where survival is the day-to-day, survival is the choices that we make in order to get through our day. And having accomplished the morning to the evening to the night, falling asleep and getting up and doing it day after day after day, that daily survival, which may sound monotonous and may sound like it's not really living, but that survival is actually this reserved power that maybe our ancestors have willed to us, have given to us. Something that's the way I look at it anyway, right? That everything that is an obstacle in my way was twice as big an obstacle for my parents and 3 times as big an obstacle for my grandparents, and so on and so forth. And that they've willed me this power, which isn't visible in the way that the rest of the society views power, which isn't visible in the way that we view it in our past, in the way that we quote unquote used to be, right? But it's something invisible that lives within us and subsists on this just mere crumb sometimes, but never ever perishes. I don't even know if that makes sense, but that's the way I like to view it.
Yeah,
Deb, go ahead.
I sort of feel like in this moment that the question is backwards for me. And I think this is what Aron is saying too, right? Like the community actually has made really clear what the values are and how I live my life as a cultural person. And I get power from the community. So, and I actually understand my identity from the community too, right? So for me, the whole thing is, I'm first generation college. My parents picked in the field. My mom didn't finish high school. They were the smartest people I knew. Didn't matter if they had education or not, but that the way that they thought about perseverance, that's power. Not whether they managed the education system, my dad was born in 1920, my mom was born in 1923, right? So they were beat for speaking Spanish in schools, all of that. But they were very powerful people, but they brought a whole community of people with them and an expectation about my contribution back to the community, both for the generations to come after me, but also a responsibility about carrying on their legacy. And to me, that's like personal power. Because as my dad used to say, they can take a lot away from you, but they can't take that away from you, right? When we get stopped, when we say something like Latino, we feel embarrassed because maybe it's not the right word in the right crowd. That piece is what makes us strong in the moment, right? It's okay if you make a mistake. It's how you address the mistake, how you deal with the mistake, how you're present to your own mistakes that makes you the kind of human that you are, right? So all those things, to me, is what power means. And then it's my responsibility to decode all those ways that other people can have that same power, because it's not finite, right? There's not a limited amount of power. We just act like there is. And my power lies here, because without the love and support of these folks here, that I'm standing with, even at my table, right? Even at this table, I end up thinking in a box and I become smaller and smaller. So it's this sort of experience that just, it just makes my heart beat, right? Like, and it makes my mind go in fireworks. That's power. To me, that's power.
I love that, Deb. I think it resonates with me too. Same kind of history with my family. I was the first one to go to college in my family, and sort of just the cognitive dissonance of that, like, am I betraying, my family by leaving? I felt a lot of guilt that I should have stayed with the family unit, in terms of common vocabulary. I think that is a beautiful way to think about it. Like, I think all Latino culture has a strong sense of family and community, even within the immediate family unit, and how that carries over into our friendships, into our environments, our created families. I always find it to be very distinctive among our culture and a really beautiful common language, because what we do, our success, is a reflection of everyone that has helped us get there. And it's it keeps me motivated as an artist, for example. I write plays about Latinos unapologetically. And it's always about that. Those are the stories I'm interested in, and how I carry the heritage, even just the friendships. At the end of the day, I'm hiring friends to be in my plays who are Latino, who don't get jobs in other places, or if they do get jobs, they're asked to play stereotypes, for example. So I love giving a human dimension to the bodies in space that we obviously all are. And I totally agree. I love how that is empowering, that whenever I feel low or insecure or, self-doubt about what I'm doing, I think about the community. I think about, like, the work that I'm doing is bigger than me. I'm trying to champion a voice and a whole misunderstood community, especially, how it gets politicized, and how it, got fear-mongered against, unfortunately. So that's like one half of the equation about power, right? It's that self-empowerment is beautiful to me. And the thing I've been reckoning with, and I don't know if you all have been doing, is like reckoning with just sort of the larger structure of just power in itself can be divisive. And obviously the way it is in our community, that if for me to gain power, who's losing power as a result? I've been reckoning with that question a lot, to see how am I being an advocate in my world, right? For women, women leadership, women directors, how am I being empowering for Afro-Latino identifying actors in my shows? White passing Latinos too, right? They often feel like, oh, like people think I'm a white person, but I love my Latin heritage. I'm proud of where I'm from, but I never get cast as that. So, ways that we can all find to deconstruct that a little bit so that, we are being as inclusive as possible of every experience and challenging our ways to think about that. That's where I've been in the last few months myself.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Do you want to dive into our third question? I'm not sure who that was assigned to. I forget the order.
I'm willing to read it if you guys want me to read it. That's fine.
That'd be great.
Does identity influence the power or influence a group does identity influence the group or influence the group has, since identity is not static? That was harder to read than I thought.
So I think if a person is empowered and they understand their culture and what they bring to the table and are unapologetic about it, it's it's a big thing, because a lot of people don't get to that point until they're older and have gone through their entire life and are like, oh, I wish when I was younger I would have known the resiliency of our people and all of these things that you don't they don't teach you in school for that reason. They don't want you to feel powerful. When every time they would teach us about anything in school, or the main thing that I would always think about is how they would teach us about the Native Americans and how it was always just slave type mentalities. We were never taught about how, they built pyramids that scientists to this day still can't figure out how they did. We never learned things like that, because they don't want us to feel powerful and understand our culture and where we've come from and how far we can continue to go. We're only taught to stay in your little circle and do your own things. No need to be unapologetically who you are and be proud of that and liberate yourself. So I think that's just very frustrating to see, because at this point, as an 18-year-old, I feel like I'm teaching my friends more about their heritage than they've ever learned from anyone else. And it's crazy that it's coming from me rather than their parents or whoever else. But I feel like I was just blessed to have the mom that I have, because these were conversations that we'd have on a daily basis from the point that I can remember to now. So.
Well, we're different generations, which is kind of the point of this, this kitchen table that we're at, virtual kitchen table, obviously. But I had the exact same experience, at least in my school. School was never, if it wasn't for sports and being able to raise a little bit of cane with some friends, I hated school. School was a suppressive force. And every book I was ever handed treated me as though I was invisible. And I had no desire to participate in my own oppression. And I couldn't put words to it. I didn't know what it was. I wouldn't have, if you had asked me that when I was 18, I wouldn't have been able to say that. So kudos to your mom. She seems like a total badass. And but I knew there was something missing in my education. It wasn't until much later that I realized that I was missing in my education. And that's crazy, right? And that we can go to school for 18 plus years, sometimes get all the way through college and still never see ourselves. So Tony, when you're writing these plays and staging these plays and casting these plays, and you're trying to break down these stereotypes and you're trying to be inclusive in a way which isn't part of this portrayal of, our gente, right? We're always the criminal. We're always the drug dealer of some sort. Even in cartoons, we're the Chihuahua or some sort of powerless entity, right? And to change that discourse, I think it's just, I already feel 10 feet tall just even talking about it. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Bella, I love that you bring up education because obviously we're all in the education house right now through various institutional engagements. So for me, I'm just reflecting on my own education that you reflected on yours. Like I remember powerfully the first Latino anything that I encountered in my schooling was reading Bless Me Ultima by Rodolfo Anaya, who just passed away this year. So rest in peace, beautiful poetic soul that he was. And it was about a little Latino boy in Albuquerque, which is where I grew up, or New Mexico. And for me, that just blew me away because I was like, oh, that's me, literally right there. And just reconciling like the power of that, of feeling seen, and for the first time reading a book that wasn't, of the Western, particularly like white Western tradition, and not having to see myself in white characters, that I could actually just identify another character who had the exact same heritage that I did. It was such a gift, and it's been so motivating for me to like gift back that opportunity in my own storytelling, because it is powerful. The first time that you see yourself, I'm sure we all have examples of that when we finally, like, whether in school or outside, pop culture, where we got to hear music that we grew up with, or, like Coco did so well in Mexico for a reason, right? People love that movie, and in here too, it was the first time that we really got to see something specific. And I think that authenticity is being demanded more. And I think that's important. I think sometimes, people have asked me as an artist, in terms of like the vocality of our community, when the injustices happen about, like stupid things like award shows, like the fact that like no Latinos got nominated for Emmy Awards this year. Why is that? How does that happen? And I think, at least in my family, we were raised to sort of keep our heads down and just do the work. We don't complain. We don't make a lot of fuss at injustice. And I'm so happy that's changing community-wise. Generationally, it's changing, that we are speaking up for ourselves more. Because I think that's the point. We want the new generation. I don't know what happens after Generation Z. Do we just start over? Are we Generation A again, or double Z? But that generation, right? We got to think about them, and they have to see themselves, in the stories that are being put out there, in their politicians, in the larger world, because they need to have that experience where it's not like Aron's, right? Where they don't feel like they're invited and that they're not included. My 2 cents on that.
I'm just curious. Maybe this takes us down one of those rabbit holes, but you mentioned Bless Me Ultima, and I loved that book. I first read it in college, but the first book for me was actually Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and it wasn't because of the book itself. It was because of the Kenyan Clutter, the teenage boy in the book. And in one of the scenes, he carries a lamb on his shoulders through a blizzard. I'm like, oh, I've done that. Because I grew up on a ranch, right? So that was the first time I'd ever seen myself in a book. And I don't know. I'm just curious if Deb or Bella have had a similar experience the first time they saw themselves in art.
Well, it's interesting because when you were talking, I wasn't thinking so much of art, but I went to a nursery school run by Mexican nuns that my family was really close to. And I describe it as being partly raised by Mexican nuns because they actually knew me. Sister Magda would say, they knew me when I was a twinkle in my daddy's eye, right? Like, and we were there every day and all the time. So my first teachers, besides my parents, were Mexican women from Mexico. And of course, they loved my family and they thought, because I was very special. So they also treated me very special, right? And so my whole experience of power and empowerment and reflection back was from my nursery school teachers. And that's, I think, the first time that it never occurred to me I didn't have I was excluded or not present in who I saw myself in my teachers. By the way, that was probably the last time I saw a Latino teacher until I was in my PhD program, as a student in my PhD program. So, but I started out that way, and I think that had an impact on me, right? Like, because it wasn't unusual, it became the norm. And I would say, and that's what my white students experience every single day, right? Like they don't imagine themselves not to be something because they're everything. They're a good guy, they're the bad guy, they're a teacher, they're the student, they can be a janitor, they can be everything, not relegated to one. And so it never really occurred to me in that way. I guess, I might say the first place I saw myself in some ways was the Bible, because Our Lady of Guadalupe was there. And, that was all over with the Mexican nuns. So that was the first literature, if you will, right? That I saw, we all know Jesus
That's art.
is Latina.
That's art.
Right? So, yeah, right. So, so that's kind of how it resonates for me.
Thank you. That's cool. Thank you.
Bella, do you have a response to seeing yourself in some, whether pop culture or not, or storytelling or not? Curious about that moment of acknowledgement.
Yeah, so one time, this was kind of just like a in-person experience. When I was younger, my dad worked overseas, so whenever he would come back to the States, the first thing he would do is come get me and my siblings, and we would go to New York to go visit his family. And the area of New York that he lived in was so diverse. That was the first time I had ever seen any Black Latinos in my life. Because growing up with my mom, she's Puerto Rican and Mexican, so all of my cousins were Mexican. The neighborhood that we lived in was Mexican, so oftentimes me and my sister were the only Black Latinos we had ever seen. So going to New York, where there's Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Black Cubans, being in that area just was such culture shock for me, because before that, I didn't know there was anybody else that looked like me and that had the same type of culture that we had. So that was a big moment for me that made me realize wow, we're not so abnormal as we're seen. We were actually we not necessarily fit in, but at least had people that looked like us. My mom, she does not look like when I would go out in public, people would not think that she's my mom. So going out in public with her and then going out in public with my dad and being in the area that he was in made me feel a lot more secure with myself, just because it made me realize wow, okay, I'm not so, unknown and not so abnormal. It made me feel more comfortable. So that was a huge thing. And then as far as literature, the only book that I could think of that was kind of where I saw myself a little bit was In the Time of the Butterflies. We had to read that in my senior year. Actually, this past year we read it. And I was wow, because usually everything we've ever read was Shakespeare or Edgar Allan Poe. So it was nothing that I would ever be interested in. And when we got the description of what the book was about, I was wait a minute, Dominican women? This is what we're gonna read about? Okay, I could get into this. I could be interested. And I read it and I was just wow, I'm surprised that we're even reading this right now. Just because, the education system is so whitewashed, to say that even certain things a lot of my friends really thought Egyptians were white because of the way that they were portrayed in books and things like that. And I was you guys think that white people lived in the desert? Certain things, I was come on now. You think they built pyramids, guys? There's no way. You get sunburned in 5 minutes. No. But just being in school, I didn't really, the books that we would read were so they were all white Western, forever ago, Shakespeare type authors. So it was nothing ever interesting. So as soon as I read In the Time of the Butterflies, I was wow, there's more literature that's not just these, these Western things. I didn't even realize that, just because everything I'd ever really read was all for school. And it was all boring old books. So those were the two big things when I was just wow, I feel, included for once. I don't feel I need to go out of my way in order to make connections to things that will resonate with me. It made sense for me to read that book, and the way that I took in the information and the way that I was just actually intrigued to read it and wanted to continue to read it. Because a lot of the times when I would start reading something, I'd be oh my God, I don't want to do this. Oh. But after once I started to read that, I was so intrigued. I actually continued to read, and I was just wow, I had no idea there was other literature that was inclusive of everybody. In my head, it was just Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, just boring things that it was all allegories that were not interesting. But those are two like big things that I was just like, wow, okay. Like I'm comfortable. My confidence, it was a confidence booster. So
can I just piggyback on that for a second? So Bella, you really brought up something for me, which was about 2 or 3 years ago. I was in Oregon, in Ashland, Oregon, where they have a big festival. It's a Shakespearean festival. So they have lots of different plays. So I went to a play by a Latino playwright. And long story long, in the middle of this story, which is based on a very white book, right? The Steinbeck book about the grapes of wrath and the Oklahoma Dust Bowl and migration. So that's basically the story, but it's told from a modern perspective and based around immigration, right? So there's this, but in the middle of it, they talk about the experience in the Dust Bowl when people from Oklahoma had to leave because they couldn't grow any crops. So they, jumped in their cars and took all their possessions because they were literally starving. And they drove, I'm a California Mexican, to California. And to sort of settle and start to figure out how to rebuild a life. And so part of the story is about how then white landowners and farmers would start to actually displace their Mexican workers to actually use the white workers to work their land because they felt bad for these people who were starving, right? So I'm telling this story because my mom told me that story when I was little and talked about what it was like when the people from Oklahoma came to San Pedro. That's where she's from in California, right? But it was one of the first times that I ever heard a story told by my own family being acted out in a play in a really predominantly white venue, like as if our history mattered about that experience. I cried. I mean, talking about it makes me feel choked up because I'm like, there we are, or there's my mom's story as if, like you said, like as if it's normal, right? Like as if we have a place and a space, as if we are no longer invisible. But it was so and somehow really connected to my mom. And so I just burst out into tears. And that's the thing, right? Like we shouldn't have to wait. And I'm a boomer, I'm 58, right? I shouldn't have to wait to be 55. I shouldn't have to wait to be 17, right? To know and see and be a part of what this picture of this life is in not just in this country, but in this world, right? Like that I shouldn't be constantly made invisible. Actually, I refuse to be made invisible.
No, I mean, that's the empowerment, right? Is to see we're using the example of storytelling of art, but, we see ourselves in the world, in the sciences, in politics, to see other people like us within their own empowerment rising up and saying, I'm not going to be invisible anymore, to use your language, Deb, is so incredibly powerful. I mean, most of the time, I've had experiences like the one you mentioned, Deb and Bella, like seeing myself in art and how that's been very validating of my experience because it lets you know that you exist too, that someone took the time to tell that story. Quick plug, Esperanza Rising is a YA novel that tells a little bit of that story. And it's not entirely about that, but it is about the California migrant workers and how when the Oklahoma white workers came over and how that sort of drove them out. It's a really nuanced story. I highly recommend it. It's a YA book, but it's still really lovely. For a second, I was approached to adapt it into a musical, so I read it and was trying to do some research on it. But a lovely, lovely book in and of itself. But no, I mean, I think that's just as an educator, hearing what you're both saying, that's what's so important to me. Being mindful of what I'm exposing my students to. They're being exposed to me, right? I might be the first Latino teacher they've ever had in a college setting, so that is important to me to own that, to speak to that. But in the last few years, I assign plays to read. For example, I teach theater. I've now just got to the point where I just don't teach any straight white men anymore. I think it's at this point, we all grew up with that, and it's not a judgment, it's not a complaint, but we have given space to that. So what in my own agency and my own empowerment can I do to expose them to queer Black women or to Indian American writers, other communities that we don't get to sort of see, so that, because I teach a diverse body of students, and I don't want anyone in my classroom to feel like, oh, I don't exist here, another space for them to feel that, because we all know what that's like. I think I grew up in very diverse areas in Albuquerque, hugely Latino, diverse and hugely Native American as well. But it's, the way that education does, it separates us. Once I started to show a little bit of, academic prowess, I was suddenly in classes with all white kids, and how isolating that could feel, and the literature that we read and the stuff that we were learning. So yeah, what you're all saying is just very resonant for me too. And it's shocking actually that generationally we've all felt that separation, that isolation. And, hopefully in conversations like this, we're remedying that the next generation, this post Gen Z generation, doesn't have to experience that struggle, that they can see themselves literally anywhere. And I think that would be such a lovely goal to get to at some point, hopefully soon.
Well, part of it too, right, is just that our bodies are almost an act of resistance in these spaces, right? So for sure your students get that. I mean, Bella's friends, like who she's talking to, also are getting that perspective because they're engaging her, right? Like it's amazing to embody that, the values, right? And values in a way in which we can actually also dispel the myths of colorism, right? That you can be Afro-Latina and you can be, lighter skinned and you can be these things and you have value. I really appreciate what you said, Bella, about that. Like, well, I'm telling my friends, they're going to get sunburned, right? Like that way that you're thinking of that. It's like, yeah.
Like, guys, it's like, just take a second, just process it. Like,
think about it.
I know we still have one question left on our queue, or maybe we have more than that, but I want to pivot to that. I don't know who it's assigned to.
It might be me and I don't have my question, so perhaps you might read it.
Sure, very good. All right.
Now that I've now revealed myself to the table.
No, I had to dig for the questions too, and I think we all have a different order. So let's see if have we asked, think of a time when you were active in or vocal about your community, in which the ways.
Yeah.
That was I don't read that one, right? No. All right, I'll ask it again. I think maybe it is a different. Think of a time when you were active in or vocal about your community, in quotes. In which ways did the way you understood your identity impact or affect the way that you were active or vocal?
Yeah.
Is that different than yours, Aron? I'm trying to remember.
It's a little different than mine, but that's a great question. I think ultimately we could ask any question about belonging, about identity, and somehow or another we're always going to revolve back to this question that you've just posed, right? How can we change things? How can we stand up, which is one of the terms that came up early in our discussion? How can we change the discourse? How can we teach our friends about this world that they think is one way and is actually many different ways? So the way that it's influenced me is that action has always been, I don't always want to take it back to literature, but that's kind of my touchstone, right? The first book that I really, 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 truly loved was Heights of Machu Picchu by Pablo Neruda. And this idea that you could lend your voice to not only a existing community, but a past community, that you could speak for them and the people that had built Machu Picchu, the slaves that had built Machu Picchu, and that you could lend your voice to them, has always inspired me, right? And then I grew up every day going to church with my abuelita, every morning mass, every morning mass. And I didn't realize until later how much of that had sunk in, but this idea that action is part of my faith, action is part of my upbringing, action is part of my education, at least the education that I liked and the education that I gravitated towards. So it wasn't until I felt comfortable in my own skin, I had this identity, that I was like, wow, I can do that too. It's important for me to write books about people from my community. And I don't want this to sound too hokey, but when I'm talking to my creative writing students, I ask, well, why are you writing, right? What's the revelation of your muse? What is your muse? And invariably, a student will turn it back to me, and I just say, every time I write, I want to save someone's life, right? Either from obscurity or from some sort of anonymity, heck, maybe even literally, but that to record somebody's story is an action, and to know who you are lends your identity to them as well. And I don't even know if that was a question, Tony, but that's kind of where, when you asked it, that's where I went. And I don't know, man, that's just, it's just so important that we know who we are so that we're never lost. I mean, I know that seems like it's just common sense, but if you don't know who you are, you could be lost forever.
I mean, I love that. To me personally, if I were more of an egomaniac, I would have been talking about the play that I wrote, because it's exactly about this stuff. But I'll sum it now in 1 minute. It's about this, it's about the future of Latino identity and how what's getting lost, right? I think the further we continue to evolve, and the play's called 2050 because it's about, the year 2050 they predict will be the year, according to the Pew Foundation, that we're going to be so intermixed and so diverse that whiteness won't be a majority anymore. But just, I think what I took argument with in the play was the fact that, white supremacy is more clever than that whiteness has evolved in a way to include more and more identities it didn't once. We look at the history of Italian Americans and Irish Americans, how they were other, how they weren't white for a long time. And it wasn't until the numbers started to increase that sort of, however we came to the decision of, however whiteness came to the decision of it, started to include them. And that's what I'm worrying about in terms of our identity. If we don't hold on to who we are and our heritage, I'm worried about us becoming folded into white supremacy, that suddenly Latinos are now just like white people the way that Irish people were, or Greeks, or Italians, which is a cautionary tale for me, because I think we lose so much in that. And it could be a seductive equation, right? Because there's power, to throw that word in there, to no longer be oppressed and no longer be marginalized. I can understand, I see it in politicians right now who are Latino, but whose policies don't reflect that, right? Who have sort of forgotten that heritage. So for me, it's the constant question that I'm thinking about, because like you, I grew up sort of learning to step into my Latino-ness. I grew up with a lot of embarrassment sometimes, like when my parents spoke Spanish in front of my English-speaking friends, I was like, oh man, they're going to think I'm different, they're going to make fun of me. And it wasn't until later that I grew in my confidence as that. And it was, taking other classes. I took an African-American theater class in college. And for me, it was the first time to be like, oh, I didn't know theater was not just for white people. Like, this is mind-blowing to me. And because of that class, which of course I don't identify as Black, but just seeing a non-white body being able to take center stage just introduced and exploded a whole possibility in my head. They're like, well, maybe I can do that for Latinos. So, however we interpret the question, I'm similar to you. I don't know. It's just like, it is an important thing to think about, because I don't want us to lose who we are, because that's so dangerous to me. And what a shame to lose our culture if it gets adopted into a larger one, into assimilation.
So do we have to live in that house that's been constructed for us, or are we allowed to construct our own house? The Audre Lorde, you can't tear down the master's house using the master's tools. Are we talking about influence and power and identity and ultimately belonging? Are we talking about belonging in a house that we didn't make, or are we talking about a house that we're making currently? I don't know. I listened to Bella. I'm like, she's building a new house, man. That's great. I'm tired of living in the old house. I want to go to her house, at the one she's building. And so I don't know. It's so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I'm laughing because I actually also use that Audre Lorde. I refer to that Audre Lorde, the same thing, right? But I tell my students, but I certainly can take the master's tools to beat him with, right? And is that education for me, right? I stand in my classes, and so I'm a director of the Latino Center, right? I believe that using my voice is something I have to do because my parents died for my education. My dad was dead by the time I was 10. My mom was dead by the time I was 24, and they worked very hard so I could access college. And they could never have imagined their daughter would have a PhD. They didn't even know anyone like that. But that was their that was their goal for me to just have a college education. And then how I think it about, I talked about legacy, but this is really about what they sacrificed. So I could make a difference. My dad was involved in the unions, before there was OSHA. He was a steel worker. So he was in the steel worker union, and he used his voice to protect the men in the steel mills. And those were Black and brown men predominantly that were being poisoned, essentially, with the particulates in the air and whatnot. And he stood up for them. And that's the model I had. I watched my mom and what she gave at the church, right? Because that's what she was, always involved in service related to church. And so I somehow combined it into social work, right? So I could have voice and give in a way that's about equity. So I think I had such amazing role. The role models for me were like the unions, including the farm workers union, right? So I saw myself there. And so thinking about that power, like the power of my own voice and the power of Bella's voice, right? And how when we're even though we look different, we're different ages, same gendered identifications, right? But the way we can embody all those places of power to challenge each other, but then to join together to actually do exactly what you said, Tony, is to resist being moved to a kind of whiteness absent of the most beautiful parts of our culture, which is what? Community, collectivism, care for each other. That's not about just the small family, but family that are included with who we are through religious ritual, through just being neighbors, right? Like that's what community means. So y'all are part of my community. And I feel very honored. I feel very honored to have you as part of my community. And that's to me what it means to be Latino, Chicano, Hispanic, Afro-Caribbean, right? That's who we are. That's the true, like the masa of who we are, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, Aron, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say thank you to Deb for telling me I'm part of our community.
This is such an energizing, galvanizing conversation, because it's exactly what you hope to find in other people who have grown up with the same experiences, regardless of generation or geography, that there is something that connects us, right? I think there's so many conversations about, what is Latino-ness, sort of this unified thing, or the Latino vote obviously has been a big conversation. It's like, well, what is this thing? And you can't answer that because, as we've now discovered, I think in the last hour of conversation, is that it's just, there's so much nuance and difference. But like, even through that, I think of this anecdote. When I go back to Mexico, my mom, whenever we go visit like my 9 aunts and uncles, she's like, when you go to their house, they are going to feed you and you better eat everything on that plate. And that's, to me, a metaphor for our community, is that we have 9 million probably different kinds of households within our community. But when you go to that house, they're going to feed you and you're going to get something out of that experience. And that to me feels so distinctive about who and what we are, is that it's that kind of exchange that we always do. We always welcome each other. We always hear each other. And I think losing that feels scary to me. But I think we witnessed that that's not the case, that we can all come together. Even in the last hour of conversation, I think as we start to wrap up a little bit, I guess I'll give a little more time just to turn to everybody any last comments of their own. But to me, this was just demonstrative of the power of us coming together. Ostensibly different points of view, different generations, different identities, but that we found a dialogue and learned to just like hear and hold each other, and hopefully metaphorically feed each other too at our tables, and just sort of see what we all have to offer about our points of view. So I'll just turn to you all in our last few minutes of discussion, just to summate or just kind of distill or synthesize our experience today.
Yeah, there's that awkward silence, right? That never happens at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Not in the Latino household. But no, I just want to say thank you to Bella, to Deb, to you, Tony, to Carlos and LCFC, to Rachel for putting this all together. It's such a blessing just to hear your story told across generations, across all these imaginary lines. Some of them are more hurtful and more of an obstacle than others. But to listen to each and every one of you, absolute blessing, and thank you so much. I oftentimes feel just defeated by the day to day, and I ask myself this silly question sometimes, but I ask myself, well, what's the half-life of hate, right? And how long does it take for all of this stuff to finally die off, knowing that there's no real answer to it? But I feel really connected, and I feel a real sense of, for lack of a better word, love. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think, Aron brings up a really great point, right? Like, where do we go to regenerate when we're engaged in this kind of struggle sometimes? And this is, for me, the Latino Community Foundation, these spaces with my family, with you, with my Latino colleagues. That's the regeneration, right? Where I find I'm giving, but somehow I'm walking around and I'm getting so much. And that's where my strength actually comes from. So I just appreciate being able to participate and be with you all.
So for me, it's super I love having this dialect with older people, just because a lot of people my age aren't at the point of where they where I could even have this type of dialect with them, and they would even have an idea of understanding what I'm even saying. And it just gives me a different perspective just to see how different the fight is for everybody, but yet how it's all for the same one cause. We're all trying to have the same goal, but just to see how different it is for everybody and what everybody has to go through in order to get to that point. It's super, I benefit from it a lot, just because it shows me there's more than one way to get things done. And there's more than one way to have an experience as a, Latinx person. And it just gives me validation in who I am, because it shows that, there's not only one particular way. I don't have to not be Black in order to be Latina. So thank you all for the conversation. Helps more than you know.
No, yeah, this has been very motivating. I think appropriately enough, I love that Bella gets the last word, because it's the generation that's coming up that's going to do their part. But of course, we're all still here. So I hope we're all still fighting in our way too. We're kicking it. We're definitely doing what we can to help the cause. So thank you all for being part of this. Aron, Deb, Bella. It was such a beautiful conversation. Thank you all for watching today.
Muchísimas gracias, Tony Meneses, and to each of our special guests, Aron Abeyta, Deb Ortega, and Izabella Williams Perez. Thank you all for sharing the time and engaging in riveting conversation. It's such an important topic that many of us might not think about, but really, really impact our lives. So, y muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes. Les quiero dar las gracias a ustedes. Son la razón de por qué estamos aquí. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this time together as much as I have. And the best part is that it's not over. There's going to be more this coming Saturday for the 7th Annual Latino Community Foundation of Colorado Our Story event. Lo mero bueno. This Saturday's lineup includes Colorado Governor Jared Polis, poet and performer extraordinaire Denise Froman. Special guests include the CEO of Naleo Education Fund, Arturo Vargas, State Senator Julie Gonzalez. We'll also meet and spend some time with our outstanding musical guest, a band that is creating new out-of-this-world music, the Latin Grammy-nominated ensemble Making Movies. And that's just a short list, just when you thought. On Saturday, we'll visit virtual watch parties reporting in and from Alamosa, the Mountain Region, Fort Collins, Fort Morgan, and Denver. It's going to be so fun to see each other as we share the event as a community. So we'll be hopping in and out of all those communities. Note it in your calendar, this Saturday, October 31st. Yes, I know it's Halloween, but just make it your kickoff party. Our Story Forum, rebuilding our future together. Let's do this, each of us. Let's call 5 friends and encourage them to attend. So cada quien, hay que hablarle a 5 amigos y decirles, Órale, vamos juntos. There's still plenty of time to register, and it's easy. The virtual doors will open at 9 a.m. on Saturday, giving you some time to navigate the eAttend platform and all of its features. Again, I am Sonia Gutierrez, and I'm looking forward to seeing you this Saturday right here on the 7th Annual Latino Community Foundation of Colorado Our Story event. Nos vemos el sábado. We'll see you on Saturday.